Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
Maybe a slightly unusual title for our conversation this time around, The Dead Man Walking. That subject actually of death is not an easy subject, I appreciate. One we don't often talk about, of course. Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly in the West, we've invented a whole number of euphemisms for it, haven't we? Passed on, passed over, no longer with us. It's almost as if, we want to find anything to say but that D word. And I think that's increased as we have lost confidence as a nation in the gospel of Jesus with its wonderful promises of what follows death. And of course, it is something we have to face up to. Someone once said that death is the ultimate statistic, 1 out of 1 die. So it's absolutely coming all our way at some point or other. Obviously, we all hope it's further away than nearer. But it is so important. It's a really key part of life. It's something we can't run away from. Incredibly painful when it happens to those loved ones around us, but one that we definitely need to face up to and be ready to talk about, and also to see what Jesus has to say about.
So what is a surprise in the Bible that we're referring to this time?
Well, for this particular surprise, we're going to look at, it's one of those little stories tucked away that actually some listeners might not even be familiar with. It's the story of when Jesus raises from the dead the son of a widow in a town called Nain. And perhaps because it's not one of the best known stories, one of the best things we might do perhaps is just read the story to begin with, because it's fairly short, if that's okay.
Of course.
So Luke 7 and verse 11, we read this. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. And they were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." And this news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country.
Not an uncommon sight in its day, presumably.
Not at all, sadly. Of course, people didn't live as long in those days, so it would have been very common to experience death, and of course to experience death firsthand. For us these days, everything is discreet, and, the undertaker turns up discreetly and the body's taken away and everything's handled well. But there, particularly in Bible times, and actually still in many parts of the world today, death and the funeral is a very public affair, and probably many of us will have seen on TV when there have been funerals, particularly in sort of Middle Eastern countries where, you see the whole crowd wailing and crying out. In the West, it's a much more somber affair, isn't it? We put on our dark suits and we're all very quiet and bow our heads, but I imagine this would have been a pretty noisy scenario. So let's not think the Western funeral, everyone, walking with heads bowed and in silence. It would probably have been that sort of wailing, weeping crowd that we've often seen on TV.
And the emphasis on the fact that he was the only son of his mother.
Yeah, did you note that? There's a typical concern from Luke for the poor, for the outcast, for those on the edge, those who have nothing, that comes out again and again in his gospel. So why is Luke noting that? Well, he says, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. In other words, this death is not only now about deep, deep grief, it's about utter destitution. Luke is saying With the death of this only son, this woman now has no one to care for her, no one to provide for her, no social security from the state, of course, in those days. The fact she's described as a widow means there were no extended family to care for her. So what she was facing now was not just the grief that many of us will have experienced when a loved one dies, the anguish, the deep gut-wrenching pain of loss, but she's also facing a gut-wrenching, bleak future. How now will she live without him?
In a sense, there's nothing too surprising about what you've said so far. So where does the surprise come?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is part of life, isn't it? Sadly, and even really sad deaths like this one are often part of life. So, yeah, no surprises at all up to that point in the story. But then Jesus comes into town, into this town of Nain, which was on the southern edge of Galilee. And, you know, whenever Jesus comes into the scene, that's when the surprises start. Still true today. The first surprise is perhaps one that we might easily overlook and look for the big surprise in this story. But for me, the first surprise is that Jesus tells her not to cry.
Ah.
I don't know about you, but I think, you know, at first sight, that seems a pretty unkind thing to say, doesn't it, to a woman grieving over the loss of her son. So it really does seem very surprising. And, maybe the crowd around would have been thinking, who is this guy who's just come into town, telling this poor widow not to cry at a moment like this?
Sounds somewhat hard-hearted.
It does, doesn't it? But of course, if we look at the text, what Luke says here is that when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her and said, "Don't cry." So this is not hardness, this is compassion. There's a deep compassion in his heart here. He somehow knows the destitute situation she now finds herself in. And it's compassion because he, of course, knows what he is going to do in this situation, though I'm sure it didn't seem like that at that moment. So there's a little surprise tucked away. And perhaps it underlines to us that, you know, sometimes Jesus might say or do things that seem surprising, out of kilter to us, not right for that moment. Hey, but you know what? He always knows what he's doing, and he always knows what he's got planned.
You said just now that the future, as far as the widow was concerned, was looking very bleak. So clearly she can't see beyond that.
Not at all. And, you know, her thoughts must have gone backwards and forwards between the grief of the moment and what lies ahead. As a pastor, I've walked with many, many people through the loss of loved ones over the years, conducted many, many funerals, and I've seen how they can drift in their emotions between happy memories of the past suddenly replaced by overwhelming grief of the loss, suddenly replaced by, how am I going to? And the number of times I've had to say to people, well, let's just take one day at once. Let's get through today. So I think the mixed emotions that were going on here in this lady would have been huge. And so this surprising comment of Jesus, "Don't cry," does seem so surprising, so odd at first.
And the next surprise?
Well, it's the big one, isn't it, in the story? It's what Jesus does in this situation. I love the detail with which this story is narrated. Then he went up and touched the coffin. Now, again, don't think coffin like in the West. It would have been more like an open bier in those days, or at most an open coffin, because people were not buried in coffins. The coffin simply carried you to the burial place, and they would normally be buried in a cave, the body allowed to decay, the bones collected a year later, and then put into a small box, what's called an ossuary, a box for bones. And it would be that box that was then buried in the family tomb somewhere. So probably either an open coffin, an open box, or an open bier. He walks up to it, he touches it. And it said those carrying it stood still. And I've often thought, I wonder why. I wonder, had they heard about this guy? No indication of that at this point. But for some reason, they stand still. And then here's the big surprise. If not, frankly, at this point, people must have been thinking the big craziness. Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." Now, again, put yourself in the story. I love repeating that. I've said it many times in this series. Put yourself in the story. If you were one of the men carrying that coffin or that bier, if you were there in the crowd, and here comes this guy, this outsider, stops the procession, puts his hand on it, and speaks to this dead body and says, "Young man, get up." I mean, what are you going to be thinking? You're going to be thinking, this guy's crazy.
Yeah, he's mad.
Absolutely. He's mad, doesn't he? Look at the guy. Surely you can see he's dead. What are you doing to this poor lad's mother? Do you not see the grief you are causing her? We can perhaps imagine all sorts of things that would have been going on in their mind at this point. But then the even bigger surprise is that the dead man sat up and began to talk. My goodness, it doesn't tell us, but I wonder if they dropped the coffin at that point.
Yeah.
Because it would have been an enormous surprise, shock to see someone whom you knew to be dead. And by the way, the arrogant Western thing of, all these resurrection stories are, it's probably because they weren't really dead and they come back to life. Listen, people lived closer to death in those days than we do in the West today. People understood when folk were dead, when their spirit had gone and the body was left behind. I've seen people die. I've been there at the moment when it happens. And you know what? Whether you're a Christian or not, I think everyone would agree that at that moment they die, it's like something goes. And what's left is not like we see on TV, someone who's stopped breathing for a moment and closed their eyes while the camera pans in on them. The appearance changes. But why? Because something has gone. For me, it's the spirit, it's the soul. Maybe for others, just the life mechanism. But people would have known this guy was dead. And now suddenly he sits up, and notice again the detail. Here's a suggestion of eyewitness detail here. He sat up and began to talk. I wonder what he said.
Indeed. And what his mother, of course, must have thought.
My goodness, remember, they've all been weeping and wailing. You've got that sort of Middle Eastern wailing background. You've got this guy coming into the scene, stopping the funeral procession, him saying this, the man sitting up, talking to his mum. And I mean, I'm sure the first thing she would have done, again, put yourself in the story. What do you think she'd have done? She'd have rushed up, I'm sure, and thrown her arms around him, hugged him and grabbed him and probably smothered him with kisses and would just have been so delighted. I love by the way, again, that little detail that the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. It's like there's a handing over and saying, here you are. Here's your mum. Mum, here's your son back. Wow, what an incredible, surprising moment that must have been.
Now, in that day, and because of their own faith, they would have been aware of stories from the past in the Old Testament, particularly as we know it now, where people were raised from the dead.
Yeah, absolutely. They would have known stories in their scriptures, what we would call the Old Testament, what they called their Tanakh, where great prophets like Elijah and Elisha had restored people to life. So there would not have been disbelief that God could do things like this. He'd done it in the past. The shock, of course, would have been not that God could do things like that, but that God had done things like that today. And particularly since this is the first example of anyone being raised from the dead in Jesus's ministry. There would be others that follow, but this was the first. So there's no stories being passed around of Jesus doing this stuff. So they would be very familiar with the fact that God had done this. But of course, I think all of us know it's very easy for us to read our Bibles and sort of think, oh yeah, God did that in those days. Doesn't do that now, does he? And I think the challenge we have to ask ourselves and put to ourselves is, well, why not? If God did that sort of thing then, why could he not do that sort of thing now? Are we putting God in boxes and saying that was for then, this was for now? So suddenly, what they knew God had done, God now is doing, and is doing for them. I mean, Nain. Where's Nain? You'd have to get a map out and try and find this place. It's a little obscure place. Who does he choose in Nain? A widow.
We don't know a name.
We don't even know a name. And it's like, you know, in the pecking order of society, as it were, she would have been right at the bottom. So when God breaks in and starts to do things like that again, it doesn't start with the great and good. In some obscure place with some small, insignificant person, actually, just like Elijah and Elisha had done when you think back to those stories.
You mentioned this is the first time this kind of miracle had been recorded in the Gospels.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be the last. The amazing thing is that Jesus will do this again. Now, these raisings from the dead are not two a penny. You know, there aren't huge numbers of them, but it certainly isn't the last time that Jesus will do this. In fact, in the very next chapter of Luke, in Luke chapter 8, there's a story that some listeners will be more familiar with, which is the raising from the dead of Jairus' daughter. Jairus, one of the leading figures in the local synagogue, whose daughter was sick. He goes to Jesus to ask for help, but Jesus gets held up on the way through a woman reaching out to him to be healed. And during that delay, the child dies, and yet Jesus still raises her from the dead. There's perhaps the even more familiar story in John chapter 11, where he raises Lazarus, his friend, from the dead. There in that story, another delay, not by someone intervening, but this time by Jesus deliberately delaying going back. So much so that his friends Mary and Martha are thinking, Lord, you know, if you turned up earlier, this wouldn't have happened. And of course, he then raises Lazarus from the dead. So we've got at least two other stories there where Jesus will do exactly this same thing.
But strange that he has only chosen a few very specific occasions for this to happen.
Yes. Obviously, there must have been thousands of people who had died during this time, and he doesn't raise them all from the dead any more than he seems to heal everybody who's nearby. We looked in a previous episode of how he healed just one disabled man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, but no mention of the others getting healed. So it's not everyone, and it seems to be that he's very selective in doing this because there's a purpose comes out each time. Now, the purpose in the story in Luke 7 with the raising of this widow's son is in what people say, a great prophet has appeared among us. God has come to help his people. Interesting, they were prophesying more than they thought there. A great prophet has come. Yeah, absolutely. God has come to help his people. They were thinking there, God's come through sending a great prophet who's done this. But of course, they were saying more than they knew. God really had come to help his people because Jesus was God incarnate, God in the flesh, God come to help us. So in these stories that do happen, there's normally some particular purpose that he wants to communicate. Of course, one of the biggest ones where that comes out is in the Lazarus story in John chapter 11, where he gets the opportunity to use this resurrection from the dead as an opportunity to speak about him and why he has come. Some well-known verses are when Martha says to Jesus, still on the way to do the miracle, Lord, if only you'd been here earlier, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus said, you know, look, your brother will rise again. And she says, yeah, I know he'll rise again on the last day, because resurrection at the end of human history was a belief in Judaism. It was certainly embraced by the Pharisees, though rejected by the Sadducees. And Jesus takes that opportunity to say, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, I do, she said. And then he goes on to the tomb, tells them to roll back the stone from the cave where he's been buried, and says those powerful words, Lazarus, come out. You can imagine them. Put yourself in the story again. All, and they're looking at Jesus, looking at the tomb, looking at Jesus, looking at the tomb. And suddenly this guy walking out, still wrapped in the grave clothes, because Jesus then has to say, take the grave clothes off him. They're completely overwhelmed. So in that story, a real opportunity there to teach about how he is resurrection and life, how if we will put our trust in him, death does not need to be the end. If ever we've needed to hear that message in the West, it's now again when people have lost hope for the future, when death is the end. And yet I've seen again and again, even among people who think death's the end, when it comes to it, when their loved one dies, you still get language like, I'm sure he's in a better place. I'm sure he'll be looking down on us now. And it's this human cry of longing and hope that is not a false hope, Jesus says. And that if we put our faith and trust in him, he is the resurrection and life for us. He is the one who can raise us again, not from the dead humanly when we die now, but raise us to new life, an eternal life, shared with God forever, so that we can go to be with him in heaven when we die and be there until Jesus returns to bring about his new creation, when he'll give us new bodies to enjoy that life in that new creation, which we'll look at in a future episode. So they're not to a penny. They are selective, and they're selective, really like so many of the miracles, for a purpose of something that he wants to communicate.
So as well as helping the individual in that particular case, he's actually wanting to help people understand who he is and why he came.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, each of these is a case of compassion. That's made very clear in this story of the raising of the son of the widow of Nain. Jesus' heart went out to her in compassion. So there is that compassion in each of these cases, but there is something far more. He is wanting us to grasp something about life and death. And he's giving, I suppose you might say, these are almost acted parables. Jesus was great at telling stories. These are acted parables in advance of what can happen for us if we put our faith and trust in him.
How do these events, these miracles, these restorations to life, by the sound of it, compare to Jesus' own resurrection?
David, that's a really good question, because it's important we do distinguish between them. In the stories of this son, Jairus' daughter, Lazarus, each of them are raised back to this life. They are renewed in their bodies and souls and spirits to come back to continue to live this life. And of course, one day, all of them would die, because that is where human life ultimately leads. The difference between those resuscitations, we might say, to make a different word, though I don't want to suggest in that they weren't really dead and were betwixt and between, but the difference between those and Jesus's was theirs was a restoration to this life. His was a transformation to the future life. His body was different. It comes back different, similar, but different to the human body he had had. Paul describes him in 1 Corinthians 15:20 as the first fruits of those who fall asleep. The first fruits were the first bit of harvest you brought to God, both as a thank you to him, but also his pledge to you that the rest would follow. And Paul uses that picture to say, when Jesus was raised from the dead to a new kind of life, it was like the first fruits, God's promise that more would follow. Who were those more? All who put their trust in him. So it was a foretaste of the great resurrection at the end of the human age, which all Jews, or almost all Jews, expected, but that Jesus had brought forward to now. It wasn't just going to happen then. It could actually start now, his resurrection shows. And I said, his body was somewhat different. Well, how do we know that? Well, because of when we look at the resurrection stories, we find that sometimes they don't recognize Jesus at first. Mary in the garden thinks he's the gardener until he says, "Mary? Oh, Lord, it's you." The two people on the road to Emmaus don't recognize him until he breaks the bread. So it's like the minute they see it, it's obvious who he was. But first, they didn't recognize him. It seems like his body can walk through walls. We read in John 20 that on the first day of the week, a week later, the disciples were all together in one place. They were praying, the doors locked for fear of the Jews, and Jesus came and stood among them. How did he do that? He walked through the wall. Please don't try this at home. You can't do this yet. So his body was very much like a human body. He could still talk and eat and walk, and he ate fish and had meals with them, and yet was gloriously transformed and somewhat different. Whereas these three stories were brought back to this life. He was transformed into the life to come with a body suitable for that.
Where does that then leave us today?
Well, where it leaves us today is, the point will come when all of us are going to die. We're there today. And it's important we're ready for that day. And by that, I don't just mean that we've made our will and, made our peace with people, but that we have faced up to what follows this life. When I breathe my last here, what next? Well, I know what's going to happen to me. I'm confident of this, not because of anything to do with me, but because of what the Bible says. When I breathe my last breath here, I will breathe my first breath in heaven. My body will die, but me, Mike, will live because I've put my faith and trust in Jesus. Jesus said, whoever believes in me will not die, but will have everlasting life. So where that leaves us is, death will one day come to all of us. 1 out of 1 dies. But if we put our faith and trust in Jesus, as the Bible invites us to do, we can be absolutely sure that when we've finished here, we'll start there. We will be with him forever, enjoying what he calls eternal life, life of God's dimension, utterly transformed, free of all the stuff that we had to struggle with in this life. If we've needed glasses, we won't need them in heaven. If we've been disabled in some way, that will probably be dealt with too, I imagine. All of these things are going to be transformed. So what a glorious hope we have for the future. If only we put our faith and trust in Jesus.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.
UCB.